Coming up on this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society, we perfect the art of keeping the glare off our GBA screens. It's dangerous to go alone, so the Nintendo Cartridge Society goes with you. Welcome to Nintendo Cartridge Society. My name is Patrick Ellers, and I am joined, as I'm always joined, by my co-host, Mark Mitchell. Mark, how's it going?
It's going great, Patrick. You know, of course, that I like to live my life loud. That's so.
I would never, ever say that about you. Loud?
So as is my fashion, I was watching Murder, She Wrote.
Right.
And there was what
Loudly cranking the bass.
one of the things that I find delightful about living in LA and watching, I feel like, and this is where I need your opinion, I feel like older TV shows is that LA like doubled for shows like Murder, She Wrote for a lot of different places.
Oh yeah,
right?
totally.
So
yeah.
There's an episode
in like the like 70s, 80s, and 90s, for sure, LA is being used a lot. It's not until like the mid 90s that we start getting a lot of stuff like in Vancouver or whatever.
Right. Yeah, because so this episode of Murder, She Wrote is set in Jamaica, but it was filmed at the Arboretum that's in Santa Anita, right by Santa Anita Park, because they have this like beautiful kind of like Victorian style home that's on a lake, and that's what they're using for this like plantation home in Jamaica. And then I remember watching Alias, because I loved Alias. I will not defend the last like 3 seasons of that show, but the first 2 seasons, very good. And I remember, at the time they had episodes where she was in Japan and she was, all these exotic places. Then you realize, oh, that's the Huntington Gardens.
Everything is the Huntington.
And that is the, parking garage at the Walt Disney Studios.
Right.
But I feel like they don't do that anymore, but you're right. Maybe it's because
it depends
they just
on
don't
what
film in LA that much.
Well, I think it's more common for comedies, right? Because comedies, I think, are generally like smaller productions. Like I think always about the Good Place filmed a bunch at the Huntington and at like the Getty, like that's where heaven is, the Good Place in the Good Place. But yeah, I feel like more and more, like if you can film out, I mean, everything films in like Atlanta or Vancouver, like those are the 2 big places.
Yeah.
When I lived in Hawaii, the like 8 months that I lived in Hawaii was between seasons 3 and 4 of Lost. So like, and I was big into Lost, and I was living on the island where they filmed basically everything. And so like watching the show and being like, I know where that is, and like that'd
be so fun.
Even when, and not even like, especially all the flashbacks where they claim to be like in LA or Seoul or wherever, like all of that is
they filmed all that stuff in Hawaii.
All of it. There are 2 scenes on the whole show that aren't filmed on Oahu. One of them is like a Charles Widmore scene where they actually, like, the actor was in London, so they just like filmed it there. And then there's like one more like really mundane thing like that. Everything else is filmed on that island.
It's been a while since I've watched Lost, and so is it super noticeable? Because maybe because you lived there, that you're like,
oh yeah, totally.
Okay.
It's no. I mean, it was only because I lived there that I could recognize. But like Honolulu is a city, like it can double for other cities pretty easily. The airport that they use, which I guess would have been the in the show, was like the Sydney airport. They were just using the like Honolulu Convention Center. So like, you can like find those things that double for stuff. But like almost nothing on the show takes place in Hawaii. Except I think that's where they land when, spoiler for season 4, I guess, of Lost, but 6 of them get off the island, and I believe they land in Honolulu. Spoilers for our Patreon. You should join it if you would like to support us in any way, shape, or form. If you'd like to hear more Lost talk or more Murder She Wrote talk more accurately, you can do that by subscribing to us to our Patreon at the 8-bit or 16-bit tier. You have access to the NCS Detective Club, which is a series we're doing wherein we watch the great detective shows of television history and talk about them. We've done Murder She Wrote, we've done Monk, we've done Diagnosis Murder. We're having a great time. And Mark, I think it's some of the best stuff that we do.
It's a lot of fun.
We're doing good work over there.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about Psych in April, which
That's
is
right.
another show that I
New
have
to
never
both of
watched
us.
before.
Yep.
So this should be a lot of fun. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Nintendo Cartridge Society.
And then we also have a Discord. Anyone who is anyone can access that Discord and have fun conversations about Nintendo stuff all the time. If there's a direct, you better believe that we are talking about it there. If there are new announcements of games or Legos or movie stuff, people are in there talking about it. Also, just squadding up in like Splatoon or Smash or whatever. If you would like to get in that Discord, you can email us at Nintendo Cartridge Society at gmail.com and we will send you an invitation. Mark, today we're talking about games we want to see on that Game Boy Advance Nintendo Switch Online library. Let's get into it. Now, Mark, we've done this kind of exercise with the various Nintendo Switch Online libraries in the past. We've done it with like NES Classic Edition when we thought, like, is it possible that there will be a Nintendo 64 Classic Edition? We've built these sort of like libraries before, but this felt very different to me.
Yeah, one thing that, I hadn't really considered until I started looking at the library for games to potentially pull into my list is what a weird life the Game Boy Advance has. Like, kind of like what a weird system
Yes.
it is. Because on the
Yes.
one hand, it makes total sense going from the Game Boy to a more powerful, like, Game Boy Advance. But on the other hand, the system was released in 2001
Yes.
and, for all intents and purposes, was retired pretty quickly once the DS took off
Right. And the DS comes out
in 2005.
in
So
2005.
So it really only has 4 years as like Nintendo's headline handheld.
Yes. Well, and you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier in the week, and I kind of want to regurgitate some of those thoughts here because I still think what I said earlier is right. But there's a lot of the GBA library that feels like Super Nintendo style games to me, right? A lot of 16-bit RPGs, like a lot of RPGs, a lot of like platformers with like detailed animation and stuff like that. And in a lot of ways, it almost felt to me like it was filling the same role that like latter day Game Boy, like vanilla Game Boy games were filling. Like that same sort of niche that like Pokemon was like rising up to fill, that like that like Donkey Kong 94 was like kind of, and 94 is still way before this, right? But like it feels like it was sort of just a continuation of what was already happening on the software side for Game Boy. Like you think about the games that originally came out on Game Boy, and they were very early NES, right? They were very like arcade kind of experiences, or like single screen puzzle kind of things. And the evolution into like RPGs and adventure games and the Legend of Zelda and all that kind of stuff, that feels like the leap from NES to Super NES, but the leap from Super NES to Nintendo 64, that leap into 3D on the console side had already been made, and obviously Nintendo would make that leap, but with the DS. So like it feels like it's stuck between worlds.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like on one hand, like I said, it makes sense as a continuation, but on the other hand, it totally feels like a system out of time.
Mm-hmm.
So I was shocked at going through kind of the list of games that were released for the Game Boy Advance, one, how few Square Enix titles are on it. Hardly any. And they're mostly like remakes.
Sure, yeah. But
And
I feel like there are a fair number of remakes.
I think there's like a dozen Square Enix published
Sure.
games, like, but
But like over 4 years, like
it just doesn't feel like that much.
it's like once a quarter.
And then it's then like looking at Nintendo's library,
Yeah.
so much of that is
Also re-releases,
NES
yeah.
games,
Mhm.
and then some games that are like in the Super Nintendo style. No mainline Mario. There is no. I think
Right.
it's the only Nintendo system, maybe arguably Virtual Boy, that doesn't have a mainline Mario platformer.
Yeah, I mean, unless you want to call Mario Clash a, this is of course me going to bat for the Virtual Boy. We should expect no less. I mean, but it is weird that there was a line of Super Mario Advance games. There were 4 of them that came out, and they were all re-releases. Or I mean, they're like ports.
Remakes.
Yeah,
And then just in gaming on a broader scale, like you said, the move to 3D had happened so long ago,
yeah.
and like maybe was, I don't know, like too young or not like tapped into the enthusiast press. I can't really remember what the like how the Game Boy Advance was received, because
Yeah, well, I know it is a running gag over at IGN, the number of Game Boy Advance games that they just gave a 10 out of 10 to, that they were like glowing about these games, partially because like that was the only platform where sort of classic, now we think of them as like retro style games, were being put out at all, right?
that's
like,
true.
if you wanted to play a new 2D Sonic game, in 2001, I mean, you're in a post-Sonic Adventure world at that point. So, like, those are the only kind of games that are coming out. But there are 3 Sonic Advance games on the system that are all, like, classic 2D Sonic games. So, like, if you were... It was like an active new retro console, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, because like you were saying, especially during that time, the idea of an indie game
Yeah, it
was
doesn't really
nascent,
exist.
like didn't
Yeah,
really
yeah.
exist. And so yeah, if you were somebody who wanted that 2D experience, that 16-bit experience that you grew up with, the Game Boy Advance was pretty much the only way to get new games in that style.
And what a long shadow that casts, too, because, like, I feel like the 2 big, like, types of indie game now are the, like, retro platformer action game or 16-bit style RPG. Like,
Yeah.
that's what the GBA delivered. It's like they saw it was so prescient. They saw the future, which was the past, and they were delivering it in the present, which is now our past. But like, it seems like it was somehow nostalgic for an era before like the market was.
When did you get a GPA? Do you remember?
I think I got it in 2001. Like I think I got it pretty early, but like that ends up being right around the time that I go to college, right? And that's a little bit of just a blind spot for me. It's I think even a stronger blind spot than I have for like GameCube, right? That I revisited a lot of GameCube games later on Wii, and I think there's just a huge chunk of this library that I don't really have familiarity with outside of like the big boys.
Yeah, I'm the same way. So I recall like one of my younger siblings getting one at some point. It couldn't have been at launch. I'm going to guess maybe in like 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And then I didn't own one myself until 2004, when I got an SP. And so just like you, like there are huge chunks of this library that I never played because I moved on to the DS really quickly. Like when the DS came out in 2005, I bought like an original style DS and then later replaced it with like 8 different lights and DSIs. It's crazy how many of those systems I bought. And then but yeah, so it was really interesting kind of going through the Game Boy Advance library because it is a system that I like have fondness for, but there are just so many games on it that are kind of that I haven't had because I didn't own a Wii U. I wasn't part of the 3DS Ambassador program, so
sure.
I wasn't able to download those. And when they were available for early adopters, so yeah, it's like it's a it's a weird system in Nintendo's history.
It is weird, and we have weird relationships with it. I think it's also just it's odd to think of it as a system that like maybe for the first time, maybe put the Wii U in the same category, of like Nintendo putting something out that doesn't feel new, doesn't feel like cutting edge even for them, you know, like um the fact that it's like a portable Super NES in 2001 should not have been impressive, and wasn't. Like, it's never an impressive piece of hardware,
Right.
right? And like, you can argue that like the Wii's not an impressive piece of hardware either, but like it's an impressive feat of like electronic
It was
goods
innovative.
engineering. Yeah, yes, and it's totally innovative. But like, yeah, there's something about that Game Boy Advance where it's just like it's not that technologically special.
And maybe because it is you know, a fairly powerful 2D primarily system, that it has, maybe that's part of the reason why, like, looking at the library and just the looking at screenshots from it, I really like the GBA,
Yeah.
because a lot of most 3D games from this era are not, we're just beginning to cross the threshold of
From
three
unacceptable
to, like, like the
Yeah.
GameCube was releasing right around this time,
Yeah.
like the PlayStation 2, like those we had Super Mario Sunshine as part of 3D All-Stars, and I think that game looks amazing.
Yeah, still looks pretty good. Yeah.
So but the 3D games earlier than this, like, not so much.
Well,
But these 2D
yeah.
games, like from Game Boy Advance, like, they still really hold up. They still look amazing.
Well, what is interesting to me is how few of them are like genuine pixel style graphics. Like, especially coming out of Nintendo, there's a lot that looks like the sort of Donkey Kong Country style of like pre-rendered and then like digitized. Um, where like I feel this way about the like the Golden Sun games, where it's like, oh, that's not like true pixel art. Like, they're trying to convey the idea of like 3D graphics within pixel art, instead of being like, no, it's a, there's something very clear about Super NES style graphics that is not really true on GBA games largely.
Right.
Or at least that's been my experience as I've been playing and like researching GBA games for this exercise here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the GBA was, or developers on the GBA were butting up against what the gaming community at large was expecting, which is
Yeah.
like 3D games on the only viable handheld system on a large market, which was designed primarily for 2D pixel graphics.
Right. And the whole thing is just like a race against the end, as the DS and the PSP like come out the same year, just a couple years later. So,
Yeah.
all right, Mark, let's talk a little bit about the games that are currently out on the Nintendo Switch online launch library. Pretty small, the smallest of these libraries that we've seen yet. Smaller even than the Nintendo 64's library when it launched. This thing launches with 6 games. They are Super Mario Advance 4, which is Super Mario Brothers 3, including all of the e-reader levels, of course. WarioWare Incorporated Mega Micro Games, Kuru Kuru Kururin, Mario Kart Super Circuit, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, and The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap.
And then just last week, we got Metroid Fusion added to that library, and there are just four more games that we know are coming sometime in the future: Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, Fire Emblem, F-Zero Maximum Velocity, and Golden Sun. Those are the only games that are like officially announced.
Right. That we got in like the sort of slideshow of here's what's coming to the GBA Nintendo Switch Online in the future. And Fusion was on that list, and then it came out just a couple weeks later. So we thought we would go through and come up with a couple of games that we think should be added to this library. But Mark, I had like a little bit of a crisis putting this list together, because I want to be, whenever we do something like this, I want to bring like my own experience. I want to bring like something a little bit esoteric, and I want to be realistic. Like all these 3 things are always at play. I don't have too much of my own personal experience with the GBA. And then like the being realistic part removes so many games. So many iconic games for the system are not like those Castlevania games. Hey, they've already been released in the Castlevania
Right,
Advance Collection.
yeah.
They're not coming. Square Enix, like the Final Fantasy 1 and 2, the remake of 4, remake of 6, those aren't coming here because Square Enix has not participated in this at all,
Yeah.
in this venture at all. So there are just a lot of places where I like butt up against what I think the reality is.
Well, I can tell you my like experience, and again, going through the list was really interesting because I realized, oh, I played a lot of NES games, a
Yeah.
lot of Super
Yeah.
Nintendo games, a lot of these, like Capcom and Square Enix games that are not going
Yeah.
to come to the system or have been released in other forms. But-
The Mega Man Zero games, the Mega Man Battle Network games, they're all in other collections. They are not going to be part of this library.
And so yeah, I would say that my list is primarily made up of games that I have not played, and so selfishly I want them on the system so I can experience them.
Yes.
And almost from like and a couple of them are more from just a historical like games preservation
Yes.
kind of aspect. That's kind of the sweet spot that I fell into.
So I think there is a small handful of games here that are obvious based on what and I don't mean to, if these are on your list, I don't mean to decry your list as obvious. But there are 3 games that, looking at the titles that have been announced but aren't on the system yet, where you're like, yes, if this is on there, then the other one of these should also be here. And again, apologies if I'm stepping on toes, but Metroid Zero Mission, Fire Emblem Sacred Stones, and Golden Sun the Lost. What is it called? The sequel to Golden Sun.
I'm gonna guess Dawn is somewhere in the title.
No, it's The Lost Age.
Oh, okay.
Something Dawn is the DS one. But so those 3 games that are sort of like these, it's those same formulas executed again on the system. Are any of those on your
I had Zero
list?
Mission on my honorable mentions
Mhm.
because I love Zero Mission, arguably, and well, I will make the argument that I think Zero Mission is the best like 2D Metroid game. I think it's amazing. It's a remake of the original Metroid with new graphics,
Mhm.
items, an additional area, new mini bosses, and like a new Zero suit section. So the first time that you can play as Samus without her suit. It is incredible, and I am very excited for the day that it's available on the GBA online.
There was also there were some data miners recently that discovered like screenshots of Zero Mission in the GBA like library thing. So I think even though it has not yet
feels
been announced,
inevitable.
it is inevitable. I think they're still just like figuring out exactly how they deploy these publicity beats for Metroid leading up to whatever, we don't know. So I believe that one is coming for sure. And yeah, Mark, I think it's I think you can definitely make that argument that Zero Mission is the best 2D Metroid. I think it's a little bit harder to make since Dread came out. But I have I'll never give up the torch for Super Metroid. But I mean, what a great series that like that's the competition.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and if nothing else, it makes the original like the
Yeah.
original Metroid playable. In
Boy,
my
that
opinion,
is
'cause
true. That is true.
I don't think I'll ever finish the original Metroid in its NES incarnation.
No, nor should you. It's too much. But okay, so then Fire Emblem, the Sacred Stones, and Golden Sun, the Lost Age. Sacred Stones is like its own like separate Fire Emblem story. It's not really connected to the Fire Emblem that's on GBA, but it is like the other one, right? And then Golden Sun, the Lost Age is the same story as the original Golden Sun, but from a different perspective. It's sold like monstrously worse than the original, so I don't know if Nintendo's actually like motivated to put it out in the same way. It sold something like 25% as well as the original Golden Sun.
Woof.
Yeah, not great. Like I think fewer than 600,000 copies. It's just not good. And so I don't know if like I said, if they're motivated to put it out, but just poetically, it would make sense. for those for all three of those games to be added to the library. But Mark, let's just start from there. We have set the table. Um, I suppose I have one more like bucket of games that I'd like to bring up.
Okay.
And that is the bucket of notable games that never made it to North America.
Okay.
Because there's sort of a bunch of them. Like really big ones that are either important to the platform or to like gaming history. That's obviously a big one that comes up right away is Mother 3, the sequel to Earthbound. And like that's how we got Earthbound Beginnings, is by had these things showing up on like a virtual console library, almost always in celebration of Earthbound. And I understand that Mother just like or Mother 3, like content wise and like licensing wise, is a tricky thing. But they do release games that had never been localized a lot on these libraries. They're usually not translated. Which would make Mother 3, virtually unplayable.
Although there's that persistent rumor that in the Wii U era, a localization was done for Mother 3 with the intention of putting it on the Wii U Virtual Console,
right?
But that they never did for one reason or another, because of content or just other business priorities getting in the way. So, theoretically, rumor-wise, they have a localization finished.
So it could be it could be on the horizons. Also in that bucket, I've got Fire Emblem: The Binding Blade, which is either a prequel to the Fire Emblem that is on GBA, or it's reversed. One of them is a prequel to the other one. I don't know which it is. But that's a game that's never been localized outside of Japan. There's Alpha Dream's first game in the like Mario and Luigi style. So the Superstar Saga they would eventually make, but the game they made before that is called Tomato Adventure.
Oh.
It's an RPG with like 2 playable characters and like quick time events as part of the fighting. Never localized outside of Japan. Would be a very fascinating bit of video game lore. There's a game called Napoleon that was released in like parts of Europe, but in French it has a different name. And it's like a tactics game where you play as like Napoleon conquering Europe or something. So like there are just all of these little things that there's a handful of others, of course, that are. I wish we could have access to them in a way in North America that we weren't allowed when the system was originally out.
Right. Yeah, that would be very cool. I noticed on the list that just like the Game Boy Advance was a NES and Super Nintendo port machine.
Yes.
For Nintendo. The same is true for the Famicom and Super Famicom in Japan. And they had ports of Famicom Detective Club.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, on the Game Boy Advance. Of course, at this point, there would not really be a point in putting them out because there's the Switch remakes. But as a like fun novelty, that would be interesting to do.
Oh, that'd be so cool. All right, enough table setting. I think sorry, I'm just looking over like the different headings I have on my list here. Obvious, but based on the announced, never before localized, already collected elsewhere. We're through all of that. Oh, Advance Wars and Advance Wars 2.
Yeah.
We get the 1+2 reboot camp coming up. So I guess they could come, but kind of who cares at this point?
Right.
All right, Mark. With that out of the way, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I will. Sure, I'll go first. My first one is going to be, and this is, like I said, a game that I never played, but would love the opportunity to. And it's Mario vs. Donkey Kong.
Yes.
Released for the GBA in 2004. It is, to my understanding, kind of like a spiritual sequel or successor to Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, which is like referred to as Donkey Kong 94. Which is like that game starts like Donkey Kong and then quickly reveals itself to be a puzzle platformer where Mario has like a bunch of new moves like like flipping and that sort of stuff that you use to traverse through levels and solve puzzles and that sort of thing. And Mario versus Donkey Kong is very similar. It's like a puzzle platformer. Mario has a goal of getting through. He's like Mario is a business owner. He's an entrepreneur of Mario's Toy
Yes.
Factory,
Mhm.
and you are chasing Donkey Kong through all these different levels in the Toy Factory.
And to be fair to Donkey Kong here, like it starts with him at home watching TV, right? He sees a commercial for a banana. He likes it. He keeps going. He sees a commercial for these like mini Mario wind-up toys, and the pupils in his eyes, they turn to hearts. He wants those toys so bad. Mario is too effectively advertising these things to a Donkey Kong who can't afford them.
So it's a game at its core about capitalism.
That's right.
And I want to play it.
Yeah.
So
Mark, me too. I also want to play it. This was on my like long list. I am a fan of the March of the Minis games.
I never.
the
So
Minis
yeah. So
games.
like the sequel to this that was released on the DS
Mm-hmm.
was March of the Minis, and the like wind up toys, I guess, are those also wind up toys?
Yeah,
or-
the
Okay.
minis are wind up toys, and so by the time you get to the DS, it's more like a Lemming style game where it's a puzzle game, but you're not directly controlling the characters. You're just sort of like tapping them to start them walking in a direction, and then you are affecting like the environment around them more than you are them. But in Mario versus Donkey Kong, you are controlling Mario in this space. He's less acrobatic than he is in Donkey Kong 94. But it's still like puzzly platformy. He still jumps, he still grabs hammers and stuff like that.
Yeah. So this is one, and it feels like the the one original entry in the Mario adjacent,
Yeah.
platformer thing that Nintendo would do a take on. And I think I would love for it to come to the system. I feel like there's actually a number of games on my list that had good reception or kind of like middling reception
Yeah.
that it would be interesting to experience now, removed from kind of like the baggage of the Game Boy Advance
Totally,
when it was originally released, and just kind of be able to better evaluate them as just like gaming experiences.
I mean, it's especially when you can put them up against something on the like NES Nintendo Switch online library, and it's or like something on the super, like how is the experience of playing Mario versus Donkey Kong going to be better or worse than playing Joe and Mac 2? You know what I mean? Like
Well,
it's gonna be better.
Well, it's also interesting reading, about some of these games and the reception that they had at the time, and where some of the criticisms of it, like the criticism of Metroid Zero Mission, that a lot of like reviewers docked it points or whatever because it's so short. Like it's a fairly
Yeah.
short experience, whereas like that's a virtue.
Yeah.
Like how amazing to be able to play
Give me a
Metroid
4-hour
game.
Metroid game. Yeah, totally.
So it's just interesting how those like what matters about these games changes throughout time, and
Yeah.
so like something like Mario versus Donkey Kong, I don't feel like it's talked about that much, and it would be interesting to kind of like be able to play it and evaluate it just through a more contemporary lens.
Can I play an interesting piece of music for you from Mario versus Donkey
Yeah,
Kong?
please.
So the title screen here, and this is so cool because like the Donkey Kong is clearly the Donkey Kong of Donkey Kong Country, right? And so this is like Nintendo proper really like using that actively, if I think for the first time, because this is before they made the
King of Swing,
right, but also the one with the bongos that's not
Jungle Beat.
Yeah, Jungle Beat, that's right. But so like they're really leaning into those designs, but they're also like leaning into the music a little bit. So this is the title screen music from Mario versus Donkey Kong, and check out the way that they wind the Mario and Donkey Kong Country themes together here. Isn't that awesome?
That is really interesting. That's also interesting because I feel like whether deserved or not, and I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to it, it seems like Nintendo of Japan has this reputation now of like being kind of begrudgingly using
Yes.
the rare created Donkey Kong Country characters like Diddy or King K. Rool or the Kremlings, and like
Yep.
they don't want it. Like there's this idea that they don't consider that like Donkey Kong, and so they didn't want to like use those characters. So that is really interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
What's even crazier is like after you do that, and then you advance to the next like the screen to like start the actual game, the music there starts with that this musical sting from the beginning of Donkey Kong the arcade game, that like do dee do do. So like in rapid succession when you start the game, you get Mario, Donkey Kong Country, original Donkey Kong music like in like 3 seconds.
That is very cool.
It's very, very neat, and I like it when Nintendo is reverent to their own history without it being like a Smash Brothers thing. Like that's just a matter of course for this game. Mark, a great pick, Mario versus Donkey Kong. For my first pick, I'm going to be true to my brand on this show and say the Game & Watch Gallery number 4. Which is a there were 3 different Game & Watch galleries on Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but the Game & Watch Gallery 4 has by far the most number of titles of Game & Watch games in it, and has access to some of the like stranger Game & Watch games like buried in it. You got to like really work at it to get to them, but they're in there. And I mean that's the one that's got is it called Raindrop, the one where you are moving clotheslines around and there's like a storm coming in, which in my mind is one of the all-time greats. Just I'm a sucker for these Game & Watch gallery games, and I think number 4 is the best one.
And it launched with Game & Watch Gallery 3.
Game & Watch Gallery 3 is on Color. But that is on the Game Boy
Nintendo Switch
Online. Yeah.
But okay, got it. And so Game Boy Advance had 4, and
that's it.
Oh god.
Yeah,
I see,
1, 2.
I see.
1 is a regular Game Boy game. 2 and 3 are Game Boy Color games. And then 4 is Game Boy Advance, which also just like speaks to the same thing that I was saying before, that like the Game Boy Color like occupies this weird like half step, and that it's almost like pre-GBA more than it is post Game Boy. Anyway,
well, in a world on the Nintendo 64, Nintendo Switch Online, that we're getting 3 Mario Party games,
right?
Why not give us that 4th Game & Watch collection?
I mean, also, like, if you're subscribed to the Nintendo 64, or sorry, the Nintendo Switch Online plus Expansion Pass, you have 3 different ways to play Super Mario Brothers 3, right? Like, you can do it on the NES, you can do it in the
All-Stars,
Mario All-Stars, and you can do it on the Game Boy Advance. So, like, if we're being that redundant, like, we can at least flesh out the Game & Watch Gallery library.
That's a great pick. For my second pick, Patrick, I also am going to be true to my heart. And that means that I'm going to include...
I said brand, but okay.
You're right. Sorry, I was thinking of the Mulan song. I'm going to be true to my brand and heart because I live life loud.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to pick the Game Boy Advance port. It's hard to call it a port of Max Payne from 2003. Developed by Mobius and published by Rockstar. Original game released in 2001, but plays
Max Payne.
So plays very different. So I was aware of Max Payne because I was subscribed to like oh man,
you're part of the culture.
Electronic gaming. That's right. I'm consuming the culture. Electronic Gaming Monthly.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was trying to remember. And I had a friend in high school who like had a gaming PC, something that I never had, and so he had Max Payne, and I remember like going to his house and playing some of it, and so like I knew what Max Payne was. I had played some of Max Payne. I had seen it being played, and I have like I was a Nintendo person for so long. The PS3 or Xbox 360 actually was the first non-Nintendo hardware that I bought, and so I do have this history of like, oh, this game on other systems is like, but this weird version is available on Nintendo hardware.
Right.
So that's the version that I'm most familiar with. And so Max Payne for the Game Boy Advance is the version of Max Payne that I personally am most familiar with.
Why not?
It is in an isometric perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Probably like the biggest... Look, this will not shock you. Max Payne for the Game Boy Advance is not an amazing game.
Right.
But it's pretty good for what it's attempting to do. Like, the biggest downside, I would say, is that enemies, you'll walk into a room and enemies that you can't see that are like off screen will shoot at you. So you kind of have to just like walk into a room and spray bullets in all directions.
Sure, this is
Just
the
to kind
this
of-
is the early Resident Evil phenomenon.
yeah. But like, it retains the same comic book style of like cutscenes from the game, and it has the voiceover narration in the cutscenes itself.
So the voice coming through that tiny little speaker.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't like in the PC game proper, Max is talking throughout like the levels and stuff, and you don't get any of that narration. And then they cut out a few levels, but kept like the cutscenes so the story's intact. I mean, it's a solid like 6. You know what I mean? Like
Sure,
it's not a bad
sure.
game. It's a crazy way to experience Max Payne, but the thing about it is one, like I did play it. I think it's a decent game, and there's far worse games on Nintendo Switch Online
Right.
libraries. But the other reason is that
Take that, Joe and Mac 2. Catching strays in this
That's
episode.
right. But the other thing about this is that sometimes we see new games being added to the NES library or the Super Nintendo library, and they are just these random third-party titles where it's like a little bit like, who cares? Like, why is this getting put on there? But especially like a weird, odd, like not licensed game. It wasn't licensed. It was, published by.
It is funny that it feels like
It
it's
feels like a licensed
yeah.
game, but yeah, like it was published by Rockstar, and like, will it ever show up on the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo Switch Online? I don't know, but I hope so, because I feel like these sort of oddities don't really exist anymore. It's kind of the same reason
Right.
I have a soft spot for licensed titles, because licensed titles don't exist anymore in the way that they used to, where and I think it's just because developing games is so much more expensive now.
Right.
Like these things, especially the Game Boy Advance and like the DS, kind of like lower powered systems that were aimed at, we'll say, a family audience, that they would get so many kind of like weird titles that, whether they're licensed titles or like a Max Payne for Game Boy Advance, and I want some of that weird history to be preserved and to like continue
Yes.
to persist and exist, because it doesn't feel like we get that sort of like weird aspect of gaming anymore, when it just feels like everything's kind of becoming more homogenous.
I mean, all of that is true and a great point. But I also want to just like direct us to, we haven't talked about this yet, you and I, in our lives. But Nintendo did just reveal the like next set of games coming to the NES, Super NES, and Game Boy libraries, and they include Xevious on the NES, so like a weird sort of like one-off game. Side Pocket, a pool game for like a billiards game for the Super NES,
Dope.
which just falls into one of those like, what is this? But the Game Boy games, one of them is Kirby's Dream Land 2, makes perfect sense, and the other one is Burger Time Deluxe.
Oh, interesting. Because
Burger Time on Game Boy.
what I could totally be misremembering, but I don't think Burger Time was on the list of titles when they were like,
No,
these are future Game Boy games coming
it was
to
not.
the.
Yeah,
Oh, that's really interesting.
right. I am also not sure that Kirby's Dream Land was either. Kirby's Dream Land 2. But whether it was or not, the point I'm driving at here is Burger Time Deluxe on Game Boy is basically the same concept as Max Payne on Game Boy Advance, right? Where it's just like, why does this port exist? And it's like, because someone will know the name Max Payne, will know the name Burger Time, and have a Game Boy or a Game Boy Advance.
I mean, I was exactly the audience for
Yes.
that. So yeah, I would love if Max Payne for the Game Boy Advance shows up on the library. That would just be absolutely amazing.
I'm going to piggyback off of this same idea because your description of like an isometric, like close enough sort of to a game that is on like other more powerful hardware. I'm going to go to Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge.
I didn't know there was a Banjo-Kazooie game for Game Boy Advance.
Mark, there are 2 Banjo games.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Are they 2D platformers?
Well, so Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge is a like top-down platforming game.
Oh.
So like it's a little bit like Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, or Link to the Past style, but with the ability to jump between platforms. And it has a lot of the same like moves, and like you can jump and have get like a little bit of a boost in your jump from Kazooie flapping her wings or like pecking around with her beak or whatever. And a lot of the same characters, and it's just like a 2D overhead recreation of the same style of gameplay as Banjo Kazooie, with far less environment variety. Um, but the story of the game is that Grunty, the witch and villain from the first two games, from Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie, goes back in time to prevent the events of the first game from happening, and you follow her back in time.
Amazing.
So, like, do you want to tell me I can't play that? Come on. It was released, well after Microsoft had purchased Rare, thank you, away from Nintendo. So I believe it's like published by like Natsume or someone like that. But it would be very cool for Nintendo to like work with Microsoft to get it out on this library, especially because it's not part of the Rare Replay collection, so it's not available to play on Xbox.
Had you played this game? Have
No.
you ever played this game?
No, I discovered it in my research.
Yeah, just another reason. I'm just curious what the music is like, because it seems like all the ingredients
Yeah.
are there that it could be really good.
I mean, I struggle a little bit with the GBA like sonic landscape. I think the sound chip in it is a like less attractive version of the Super NES sound chip, and it's always coming out of that tiny little speaker that sounds capital B bad. So, and I have found that as I'm playing the games on the Nintendo Switch, that I'm enjoying the music more just because it's coming out through like a real speaker. Or like my sound bar on my TV. So yeah, that's a little bit of a hurdle that I'm still getting over. Mark, the other Banjo game, and this is just going to be an honorable mention for me, is a game called Banjo Pilot. It is sort of Rare making good on the Diddy Kong Pilot, the sort of like sequel that they were working on to Diddy Kong Racing. But was in various states of no good, and Nintendo like kept delaying it and never releasing it. But Banjo Pilot, which is it's a kart racer where you're only flying planes, and it's the characters are all Banjo Kazooie characters, and it's like a fully fledged like kart racer in planes.
Wow,
that came out on the GBA. I would
crazy.
also like to play it, but I'm putting it in the honorable mentions category.
Yeah, if only one can make it to the library.
That's right.
It should be
Grunty's Revenge.
Grunty's Revenge.
Yeah.
My next pick is one that I don't know exactly how they would pull it off. Maybe like the IR sensor on the right Joy-Con could be used for. Anyways, I'm talking because I'm talking about Boktai.
Yes,
The Sun is in Your Hand, which I believe we've talked about on this show before. But it is a Game Boy Advance game, obviously, where the game's cartridge on the GBA had a photometric light sensor that measured like the light exposure to the sun. And so when you start up this is also a game that I've never played, but have been so fascinated by just because of this gimmick. It was produced by Hideo Kojima of Metal Gear fame, and now I guess of
Death Stranding
fame. But so when you start up the game, it like asks where you're located because it tries to sync the action of the game to your location because the time of day is really important. You have a weapon in the game that is charged up by the sun, and the way that it gets charged up is because you are literally, out in the sun, and that photometric sensor is, filling up. And when your gun when the weapon, I think it's a gun, like runs out of power, all the enemies and everything become harder. And so this is such
what a terrible night for a curse.
It was such a unique idea for a game. I just don't think it like anything like this is. There were a couple of sequels, one that was released in the US, one that is Japan only. But I would just love the opportunity to play this game as it was meant to be played. Would it be fun? I don't really know. Would I have the patience for it at this point in my life? I doubt it.
Right.
But what a cool experience! What a fun idea! And something that I think would be awesome if they found a way. And that's why I was saying, like, oh, like maybe the IR sensor, because it's like light sensitive, could be used as a facsimile. I don't actually really know how that would work. But
Yeah, I mean, just like you must have been able to trick the original one by like exposing it to like a light bulb or something, right?
yeah, I actually don't know. It would make sense that that were true. I don't
Mhm.
know if it was like measuring specific like bands of light that only the sun, can, or one of those like sad
feels
lamps
so
can.
that feels so advanced. Yeah, that's right. If you
Can
have a sad
measure.
lamp, then
Yeah.
it's okay. So you just got to find like a college somewhere where they've got sad lamps set up. That's the only place I've ever encountered a sad lamp.
Yeah. Maybe I feel like I've seen it on people's desks in like an office,
Mm.
if you're away from the windows and it's wintertime and stuff.
That makes sense. That's it. That's Boktai is a good pick. Where should I go next, Mark? All right, I'm gonna throw down a challenge one.
I don't know what that means.
The challenge is Mario Golf Advance Tour
Okay.
because I've been hearing forever about how Mario Golf on the Game Boy Advance is like the one that got
So
it right.
true. So
Um,
true.
And I just need to experience that. I need to see what people are measuring every Mario Golf game against since it came out. I need to experience that. I need to see why it's fun. So let's get Mario Golf Advanced Tour on the NSO library.
Yeah, man. My understanding of why it's so revered is because it like has true RPG elements.
That's what I keep hearing. But like,
Yeah,
how
but,
true
like,
can
what
that
that
be?
means,
What does that mean?
How does it manifest itself?
Yes.
Like,
I-
why does that make it
yes.
so much more fun? I'm with you. I'd be very interested to experience that game.
I would anticipate spending very little time with it, but like I just gotta know. Like I just gotta be like, hey, is this actually special? Let's find out together.
I have a bunch of like honorable mentions
Mm.
that I would like to just like touch on in passing at
Okay.
the end,
Yes,
probably.
yeah.
But this is my last like pick.
This is your last solid pick.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it is another game that I never had the opportunity to play. And we actually touched on it a little bit earlier when we were talking about Mario versus Donkey Kong. And this is DK King of Swing, which was
Mm.
released in 2005, developed by a Japanese company called Payon and published by Nintendo. This is another one of those, like, again, now the reputation is Nintendo, like Nintendo of Japan really disliked the Donkey Kong Country and kind of like used it begrudgingly if they used it at all. But this is one that, again, like features Diddy Kong, features King K. Rool. He's
Mhm.
like the villain of the game. Plays like, as I understand it, like Clu Clu Land, the
Yeah.
NES game.
I've got bad news for you, Mark.
Where, is it not good?
This is not a good
Oh,
game.
really? This
Yeah.
is one that I wasn't sure if it was like, oh, we need to evaluate it
No, we do
away
not.
from,
No.
like the
I don't think
the
there's
time.
I don't think there's a context where this game makes sense or is fun.
Well, Clu Clu Land was an NES game where you are like kind of like in a maze. It's not a maze. It's a grid, like a field that has different pegs on it. And when you come up to a peg, if you want to change your direction, the only control you have is kind of like reaching out. I don't even know what it is in Clu Clu Land. Your tongue, an arm.
No, it's you've got
your
like little
appendage
claws
to
and
like grab one of the
mhm.
pegs and swing yourself in the direction you want to go. And
So
then that, like,
you are selecting like right hand or left hand. So like depending on which direction your little dude is facing, that right hand could be the hand that is like up. It could be the hand that's down. It could be the hand that's left. It could be the hand that's right, depending on which direction he's facing. And if he grabs a pole, then he'll spin around that pole. And this is exactly the way Donkey Kong or DK King of Swing controls.
except instead of being on like a grid,
You're
it's
climbing,
it's a
yeah.
platformer,
Right.
of a sort.
Of a sort, yeah. But it is like maddening to like wrap your head around the control scheme of this game. I Mark, I simply cannot endorse this pick.
Well,
No, it's a good curiosity though.
yeah, I mean that how funny that that's the one that you've played and are like no.
No.
But yeah, I would be interested in playing it, and I feel like it's one of those Nintendo curiosities that, especially because of its kind of like history,
Yeah.
between Donkey Kong Country games, still using Donkey Kong, still using some of those characters. I think it would be interesting to check out.
Okay, so I suppose I still have two more like
Sure.
picks. Thing is, I just like made a list of games that I again remember I said I had all these like other headers.
Yeah.
And this header is genuine candidates for this exercise. And I still have 5 games left
Yeah, let's hear it.
on my genuine candidates for this exercise. I'm gonna go with Drill Dozer. A game that I have never played, but comes out of it's a Game Freak game. The people who make all of the Pokemon games.
This one has a good reputation, right?
Great reputation, yeah. And it is a platformer where you play as a girl in a like tank kind of thing, like a mech that just has like a giant drill on the front of it. So she moves left to right, she jumps, and then you can drill forward or in reverse. The right trigger is drill forward, the left trigger is drill in reverse. And everything in the game, all of the objectives are built on your ability to drill and reverse drill. So there are some things where like you're drilling into a wall and the wall breaks and you get access to new areas that way. But you can also start to drill into something and then reverse drill and it like shoots you back out. And it's just that kind of thing where the drill becomes your main way of interacting with everything. And it's just these sort of like platformer puzzles of like, okay, how do I get through this? I know I'm going to use my single tool on this some way to advance. And it just seems like it'd be a ton of fun.
Yeah, that seems like a great pick.
A game I've never played. And then I gotta go with the Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past and the Four Swords.
I had Four Swords in my honorable mention.
Yeah.
Because Link to the Past, it's an interesting version of the game because it was mapped for 2 buttons and how they got around that and all that kind of stuff.
Crazy.
But Four Swords is very cool, and I know that there's Four Swords Adventure and, like Triforce Hero that kind of is a play on it. But yeah, it would be... And they've given away Four Swords, like on the 3DS, they gave it away.
Right.
As a... I can't remember what the occasion was.
Yeah, I can't remember either.
For some reason, you could download it for a limited time. But yeah, it would be awesome to see Four Swords come back.
Especially because, and we've talked about this with like Triforce Heroes, of like that these kinds of multiplayer Zelda games where you need to have multiple people playing barely make sense for the systems that came before the Switch. With Switch, there are so many users, so many people have it, and the online is good enough. And like your friends list is robust enough, and it has like this whole other app if you want to communicate with people, whatever. That like, why doesn't a game like that exist on Switch right now to play together?
Yes, I mean Four Swords, yes, but that just makes me be like, give us Four Swords Adventure.
Give us Four Swords Adventure, Triforce Hero. Like, give us all of them.
That would be so cool. That'd be so much fun.
Yeah, it's that one feels like a no-brainer to me. And like, yeah, does it mean then we're putting another version of Link to the Past on here? Sure, there are 3 versions of Super Mario Brothers 3. I think it's okay. I think we'll survive. All right, so we're just into honorable mention territory at this point.
Okay.
I will start with one, Wario Land 4. The Wario Land games are endlessly interesting to me, but I don't have a ton of patience for the 2 Game Boy Color games, Wario Land 2 and Wario Land 3. I believe it's 3 that's on the Game Boy Nintendo Switch Online right now. Just because I kind of find the color aesthetics of the Game Boy Color to be like repulsive. I'd rather they be in pea green, black and white, But the Wario Land 4 is a full color version of Wario Land, and has that very like 90s Nickelodeon like gross out aesthetic to it that I find fascinating. Before like the series switched over to, I mean, Wario Land Shake It is a game that I love on the Wii, but that is like a sanitized version of the art style. Wario Land 4, it's still ugly, but it's in like a fun, colorful, ugly kind of way.
It's in the Wario spirit.
That's right.
Actually, it's 3 honorable mentions.
Wow.
Tied up into one. And again, it's kind of like I don't think these are probably very good, but I think they should exist so that way they can like persist into the future. And that is the Donkey Kong Country games being ported to the Game Boy Advance.
Now, why wouldn't they be very good?
I just because they're like you can play the originals,
Right,
on the Super Nintendo, Nintendo Switch Online, and I'm sure these are inferior versions. I just, I think back to conversations we've had in the past about the Game Boy Mega Man games.
Yeah.
And how they are, at least as I remember our conversation, remakes of like NES Mega Man games for the most part.
They're kind of remixes, except for number 5, which is like whole cloth new.
And you just like they don't exist anymore.
Right.
You aren't able to play them, in like illegal means. Capcom hasn't packaged them up and put them for sale anywhere. And it's like, yeah, like are these maybe I haven't played them. Are these maybe not the best versions of Donkey Kong Country? Like I imagine that's probably the case. I imagine the Super Nintendo versions are.
But also, why wouldn't they be? A Game Boy Advance is not less powerful than a Super Nintendo.
Yeah, I don't know if they had to make
it has fewer
compromises
buttons,
for like.
I guess.
Oh, I just didn't know if they needed to make compromises like like they did for the Game Boy, like screen real estate, so you just don't see like as
maybe
much.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure. But like you keep bringing up in a very salient point. There are 3 ways to play Super Mario Brothers, and
Yes,
it feels
that's right.
like the Donkey Kong Country games. I mean, on the regular Game Boy, I'd love to see the Donkey Kong Land games.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why those? I mean, the Game Boy library is very new still at this point, so they may be coming again. Burger Time Deluxe. So like, I feel like there are no rules.
Yeah, anything could happen.
But yeah, I'd love to see the Donkey Kong Land games on the Game Boy, and yeah, let's have the country games on GBA. In that same vein, I mentioned that there are 6 Sonic Advance games 3 Sonic Advance games that are all like 2D Sonic games. I'm sure they're not like the greatest, but I bet they're pretty good. So like if we could have those on there, that would be awesome. Mark, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
A little like trivia question. Which do you think there are more of in the Game Boy Advance library? Tony Hawk games or Shrek games?
I'm going to guess Tony Hawk games?
It's a trick question. They both have 7 entries. More than Mario, more than Final Fantasy, more than anything.
Incredible.
Except for there are 10 Yu-Gi-Oh games on Game Boy Advance, so I guess Yu-Gi-Oh edges them out.
What kind of I don't know if your research went this deep. What kind of games are the Shrek games? Is it all like different types of games?
I refuse to look into it.
Of course, I forgot your strict no Shrek GBA games rule.
Look, if they want to put out a Shrek GBA collection, like that's
Patrick. Everyone has to have a code. I'm not begrudging you.
Man has to have a code. I'm also interested in trying out WarioWare Twisted.
Oh yeah,
the WarioWare Mega Micro Games. WarioWare Incorporated Mega Micro Games. The name of that game throws me all the time. Also, the S at the end of micro games is a $sign. But the Twisted version of the game has like an accelerometer built into the cartridge itself, so it could like read you tilting it. Obviously, the Joy-Con and Pro Controller can do all that stuff. Ditto Drill Dozer, it's not an accelerometer, but it has rumble in that cartridge. I think it's neat how between Bokai, Drill Dozer, and WarioWare Twisted, that there's all of this like extra hardware built into the games to make the system like do more. And most of those things can be done on what the Switch is already. So it'd be really cool to bring that game to the system as well.
And you were talking about earlier games that never made it out of Japan, and the original Rhythm Heaven was a Game Boy Advance game that was exclusive to Japan. It's been a while since we've had a Rhythm Heaven game. The last one was like one of those collections like WarioWare Gold on the Nintendo 3DS that kind of packaged up a best of. But that would also be cool to bring over here, and those don't require that much like to my memory there's not a lot of like dialogue in those, like it feels like it could be brought over pretty seamlessly.
I have two more games I wanted to shout out that are both like basically just like versions of games that appear elsewhere. But Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper, it is one of the so Street Fighter Alpha 3 is sort of like the definitive full version of the Street Fighter Alpha games. But on both GBA and PSP, there were these versions that were like subtitled Upper that had a few more characters in them that you couldn't play on the home console versions or in the arcades. So I would like a chance to play a version of Street Fighter Alpha 3 with those 3 extra characters in them.
Remind me, what is Alpha?
Alpha takes place between Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2.
Oh, okay.
So the timeline of Street Fighter goes Street Fighter, and then Street Fighter Alpha, which would come out in like the late 90s, and then Street Fighter 2, and then Street Fighter 4, and then Street Fighter 5, and then Street Fighter 3 is like the end of it.
Okay.
I don't know when exactly Street Fighter 6 takes place. Maybe probably after 5, but before 3. I don't know. Yeah, so it was like before they were ready to move on to Street Fighter 3, they were doing like this sort of like interquel series, this prequel series to 2, that had like cartoonier graphics and like did more with like meters and gauges and stuff. So like building up super moves and like ultra combos and stuff like that. And it's as far as the Street Fighter games are concerned, is a little bit of a blind spot for me, just as I wasn't like in a there is a version of Street Fighter Alpha 3 on Super NES, but it's like a late Super NES game. It's like a 1997 Super NES game, something like that. So I never had it, never really got to play it at home. But yeah, I'd love to play this version on the GBA.
The final games that I'm going to shout out, again, not familiar with at all, but of course there are Pokemon games on the system, including Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, the third version,
right?
And then Fire Red and Leaf Green remakes of Red and Blue / Green.
This is also where the Mystery Dungeon games get their genesis, is on the system as well. So it's just a lot of Pokemon games. Not as many as there are Shrek games. What about we haven't touched on the pinball games. There's a Pokemon Pinball and a Mario Pinball Land. Did you encounter either of those in your research?
I've never played either of those.
The Mario Pinball Land looks bad. Like there are portions of it look like the boss fights from Kirby's Pinball. What's that game called? Kirby's Pinball Land?
I can't remember.
Do you remember we played this for Kirby
remember,
Month?
Yeah.
But there were like those boss fight areas where it's just like one little room where you had to like attack the enemy using Kirby as a ball. That seems like the entirety of the game, instead of just like a little side mode, which feels like a bummer and a missed opportunity to me. But I don't know. Maybe it's weird that they were still making pinball games for the Game Boy Advance. All right, Mark, do we have anything else to say about games we want to see come to the GBA library on Nintendo Switch?
I mean, just that going through this library and talking through your picks, it just makes me realize there are a lot of interesting Game Boy Advance games that could still be added to the library that I want to get my hands on. These like oddities. There's
one last thing I want to like talk about here, and mostly because we didn't really talk about it. Why do we not have any of the rest of the Super Mario Advance games on here? Just because they're re-releases of games that are already available on the system?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It didn't even cross my mind.
Yeah. Right, where it's like, why would I want another version of Super Mario Brothers 2? Again, we already have 2 versions of it. But not one where Mario won't shut up.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, let's close this out. Of course, if there are any Game Boy Advance games that we have neglected to mention here, it doesn't seem possible. It feels like we talked about the whole library. And please don't tell me what any of those Shrek games are like, please. But you can write into us at Nintendo Cartridge Society at gmail.com. I guess we didn't talk about any of the like Final Fantasy games, really. There's a Final Fantasy Tactics Advance that's on there too. But I'm just like, again, this is the realistic side of me where I'm like, Square Enix is not putting anything out on this thing. Sad, but true. That's going to do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Thank you to our 16-bit patron, Connor McCabe. Thank you, Connor. We appreciate you. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Patrick_Ellers. Mark is at MK Mitchell, and the show is at Nincart Society. We also have the Discord, which you should get in so that you can have fun Nintendo conversations with us all the time. Write into us for an invitation. Nintendo Cartridge Society at gmail.com. Anthony DeLuca made our logo. Our theme music is provided by 8-Bit Betty. You can get more of his music by going to 8bitbetty.com or by listening right now. For my co-host, Mark Mitchell, this is Patrick Ellers saying thank you for listening.